With any indigenous population,
Yes.
when Europeans arrived, the first thing that affected the population was disease. In South America, in the native populations of America, we had no exposure to influenza, the common cold. And then weapons were introduced. The guns didn't exist.
Yes.
So these things decimated the population of the Maori just as they'd done to other places.
Who are the Maoris? Are they the original inhabitants of New Zealand? Who are they?
Originally, New Zealand had no inhabitants, but we were the first people to arrive in New Zealand. And
Okay, the Maoris are the first people to arrive in New Zealand. So
we're Polynesian, so we're part of the Polynesian Triangle. So
wow.
we're related to the Hawaiians and the other Polynesian groups, the Niueans through there. And we were the first to arrive and to settle in New Zealand,
Yes.
the indigenous population. And when the Europeans arrived, actually it was the Dutch that first arrived in New Zealand. We didn't actually land, but that's why New Zealand has the name. It's actually a Dutch name.
Yes.
It's not an English
Wow.
name. Yeah.
The situation in New Zealand now, whereby the Maoris are in the minority. So what do you think is the difference between the situation in New Zealand and what happened in South Africa?
If you look at a lot of the African nations
Yes.
that had European colonization come in,
Yes.
they maintained the majority still.
Yes, in terms of
South Africa, Mozambique,
Yes.
such as yourself, Nigeria,
Kenya, Ghana, yeah.
Ghana, all these places. And South Africa was an interesting one because the power and the money and the government and the police was all controlled by the Europeans. So that created a big tension. It's a different story in New Zealand with the European population becoming the majority.
You said you're from the New Zealand. So the first thing that came to my mind was the Maori. So, and the haka that they do, especially the lady in the New Zealand parliament.
Yes.
That was the haka. So are you Maori?
Yes, I am Maori. So
Yeah.
a lot of times people ask me where I'm from and
Yes.
they try to figure out, and Maori can often look like other nationalities or ethnicities. So often people mistake me for Middle Eastern or from Turkey or from Spain or from the Mediterranean,
that's
often
right.
South American. So I'm often saying, yeah, I'm Maori.
Yeah.
Recently, the big news in the media is the protests down in New Zealand
Yes.
and what the government is trying to put through, the bill to change the treaty which we have in New Zealand.
Yes.
In 1840, there was a treaty signed between the British Crown at the time and a lot of the hapu. Hapu is a word we use for sub-tribe. Maori belong to an iwi, which is a big tribe.
Yes.
And then that iwi is divided into hapu, which is a sub-tribe. So the leaders of the hapu signed that treaty with the British. And there's been a bit of controversy. It was signed in two languages, in English and in Maori. And the translation can often be misinterpreted between the two. So what the current government is trying to do is do amendments to the treaty,
Yes.
which we thoroughly disagree with, which is why there was a haka in Parliament. So haka is used for many different purposes. It's most famous
Yes.
for sports. So when you see rugby, the All Blacks do it. As we discussed earlier with our
Yes.
Nigerian Kiwi,
Yeah.
the UFC. So sometimes those guys will do a haka as well when they're celebrating something. So yeah, it's used for many purposes. And in this purpose, it was used as a protest to show the disagreement with them trying to push a bill through Parliament that Maori are not happy with and disagree with.
You know, I read some of the reasons why they had protested, just like you said. But most of the people in Parliament say that the bill is not likely to be passed. But the Maoris are still protesting. So why are they protesting if the deal is not likely to be passed?
The way that our government is made is we are not like the American system where one party wins outright and they run the government.
Yes.
So you have the Republican and the Democrats, one party will get the most votes.
Yes.
The way we work in New Zealand is similar to other countries where we have multiple parties, the two major parties and then minor parties. What's happened in New Zealand is to create a government, the major centre-right party has joined with a couple of other parties
To form a coalition.
form a coalition.
Yes.
And one of the smaller parties is a right-wing party, not an extremist, but they're a right-wing party. And part of their criteria of joining that coalition is this bill is presented to Parliament. So they're trying to do that. What Maori is saying is that if you have an agreement between two people,
Yes.
the mere fact that one party involved in the agreement has decided to openly start discussing changing it is insulting.
Wow.
It's insulting. So it shouldn't have even gone to government, but the coalition has put that through the government because of forming that coalition. They've given, that was one of the agreements that they made. And so we find that, as Maori, we're finding it insulting that the fact that the bill has even gone this far.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. You know, the population of New Zealand, the last I searched was around 5.3 million people.
Yes.
And the Maoris are probably 700 and something thousand people.
Around 20% of the population.
Around 20% of the population.
But
So
little less than 20%.
I really don't understand. Is it that the who are the Maoris? Are they the original inhabitants of New Zealand? Who are they?
Originally, New Zealand had no inhabitants, but we were
Yes.
we were the first people to arrive in New Zealand, and
Okay, the Maoris are the first people to arrive in New Zealand. So
we're Polynesian, so we're part of the Polynesian Triangle. So
wow.
we're related to the Hawaiians and the other Polynesian groups, the Niueans through there. And we were the first to arrive and to settle in New Zealand,
Yes.
the indigenous population. And when the Europeans arrived, actually it was the Dutch that first arrived in New Zealand. We didn't actually land, but that's why New Zealand has the name. It's actually a Dutch name.
Yes.
It's not an English
Wow.
name. Yeah, they were the first to arrive. And I think the French and the English turned up around the same time.
yeah.
And the English had been over in Australia and settled Australia. And they wanted to make a treaty with the indigenous population, which is why the treaty was signed in 1840 at the time, because they wanted to show the other European powers. There was a lot of fighting globally about even within Africa or Southeast Asia, where the superpowers at the time, which were the European countries, were trying to land grab or get as much land as possible. So by signing the treaty with the Maori, they wanted them to cede sovereignty or governmentship over to the British Crown,
Yeah.
which is what happened. And once that was signed, then the French and the Dutch kind of gave up on the idea. And that's another reason why the English were pushing for that treaty at the time.
So you're saying that the people that came later, that's the people from the UK, the Crown, occupies a much larger population than the Maoris in New Zealand.
With any indigenous population,
Yes.
when Europeans arrived, the first thing that affected the population was disease. In South America, in the native populations of America, we had no exposure to influenza, the common cold. So, and then weapons were introduced. The guns didn't exist.
Yes.
So these things decimated the population of the Maori just as they had done to other places.
Wow.
And over time, more and more immigration came to New Zealand, and eventually the European population became the majority.
But did the Maoris, did they fought with the Crown? They fought with the Crown?
They fought with the Crown. There's some historical events where the English landed and were repelled very violently.
Yes.
And then there is the Maori land wars, which actually happened after the treaty, where
Yes.
the Crown decided, even though they had signed a contract saying Maori would keep their sovereignty rights over their lands, decided to confiscate lands and take lands. And so there was actually a big war that went on between the Maori and the Crown back then.
Wow. So the situation in New Zealand now, whereby the Maoris are in the minority. So what do you think is the difference between the situation in New Zealand and what happened in South Africa?
If you look at a lot of the African nations
Yes.
that had European colonization come in,
Yes.
they maintained the majority still.
Yes, in terms of
South
population,
Africa, Mozambique,
Yes.
even such as yourself, Nigeria,
Kenya, Ghana, yeah.
Guyana, all
Yes.
these places. And South Africa was an interesting one because the power and the money and the government and the police was all controlled by the Europeans. So that created a big tension. It's a different story in New Zealand with, the European population becoming the majority, but the fastest growing demographic is actually Asian in New Zealand, and in particular Indian. So we say we're a melting pot of cultures, which is very different to Korea. Obviously, you and I would know. We're very much the minority here.
We're very significant.
We're a drop in the bucket.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
It's interesting because it's still playing out. The treaty was only signed in 1840, so as far as history goes, it's a very young nation, New Zealand. When it was, we would say that's our founding document. Most countries have a founding document or a date that they would put as when the nation was created. We would say New Zealand was probably founded on that document around 1840s, which is not that long ago.
Wow, that's a very interesting one. Like for the Maoris, in terms of are they economically disadvantaged in the Maoris, or is there like a kind of a very big economic gap between the Maoris and the whites, the British that came to New Zealand?
So now the people that are in New Zealand now wouldn't even probably call themselves British. They'd call themselves New Zealanders or Kiwis because they're fifth, sixth generation, right?
Yes,
so they would not even consider themselves. Maybe they would trace their ancestry back to being Irish or Scottish or other European ethnicities, but they call themselves Kiwis or they call themselves New Zealanders. And Maori tend to overrepresent in all the negative measuring tools, so health, lower life expectancy, overrepresented in imprisonment stats, unemployment, they overrepresent. So if you took the actual percent of the population and where they represent, it's not good. Similar to that of other nations that were colonized as well, Australia or the US. So there was discrimination earlier on when it came to employment, when it came to land, having your land confiscated. But also there were stories where, and this will be interesting for people who are Korean or such as yourself, where you have your native language. You speak Nigerian or the Koreans speak Korean. When my grandmother was at school, she was hit if she spoke Maori. The European people or the government was really pushing to bring Maori into the European lifestyle, the way you dressed, the way you spoke. The same thing happened in Australia, the same thing happened in the US. So Maori came close to losing their language, to losing a lot of their culture, but now there's been a massive resurgence. Under the treaty, the contract they signed, they should have been guaranteed that. So the treaty was not upheld for so many years. And now for my cousins and my nephews and my nieces, Maori is their first language. And so they've there's now Maori schools, there's now Maori television channels where they speak Maori, Maori radio stations. You can watch the rugby in multiple languages. So you can choose Maori or you can choose English. Whereas that 50, 60 years ago, that never existed. And I think there was a real chance that the language and the culture could have gone into decline, but it's come back, so which I'm very happy for.
Most of us, apart from I know about New Zealand before now, Australia. My brother schooled in Australia, so I know about New Zealand. And another thing that I've put the New Zealand politics, not New Zealand now, but the New Zealand politics in the map, is this lady in the parliament that always says the haka, something. So she says that, and she has this kind of aura that, once she says that, that kind of vibration, understand, that comes from her, and people can relate to that, people can feel that passion from her. So who is she? I think maybe she's among the most popular or the youngest politician in New Zealand.
She's a very young politician.
Yes.
And we have official languages in New Zealand. English is an official language, but so is Maori. So you can speak Maori in Parliament because it's our official language.
Wow.
In Korea, everyone speaks Korean in Parliament or in the government, right?
Yes.
there were a lot of people offended by what she did, saying that there's a time and a place for doing a haka, and that house is not the time and the place. But I would argue that's the perfect time and the place to protest or be upset about that. Yeah, she is quite young, but she represents a group of young Maori, well-educated, very knowledgeable about their rights that are coming through.
Yes.
So, like I said, with television now, there are young Maori who are fluent in Maori, who are very well-spoken. Lawyers are coming through, accountants, business people. It's a bit like, I would compare it to the first generation of immigrants, the Koreans that went to the US. A lot of them started out in convenience stores, they started out in dry cleaning, but the generation following them are now the lawyers, doctors, accountants. Their kids became very well educated in the US.
Yes.
Maori like that too, and she is a perfect example of what's coming through from the younger generation of Maori. They know their rights, they know how to express themselves, and they're doing it in a very British setting because our parliament is built on the European structure, the British structure.
Yes.
So people would argue, you must speak English, you must do it the European way, but we're not European, we're New Zealand.